Dr. Bino, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Allow me to briefly also introduce for our audience a quick summary of what we're going to be discussing today. It's going to be a very interesting discussion, I bet on that. But allow me to just summarize that what we're having today as a first in a series of podcasts will be a discussion aiming to highlight different aspects of wildlife conservation through interviews with guests like you from a variety of backgrounds that actively work and support conservation efforts. And certainly the topic will be conservation in Albania and the role of civil society organizations. I know before jumping into the roughly 6 important topics that we structured for this conversation and discussion today, it would be nice also for the audience to have a quick summary of who Dr. Bino is, and allow me to do that for you, Dr. Bino.
The legends.
It's always a pleasure to talk about people like you dedicating many years of their life in their profession. I know we had a big discussion about making this bio shorter for you, and I fight hard to actually keep some of the most important topics in place. So let me just summarize and say that you have had a PhD, got a PhD in biology and evolution and ecology at Montpellier II University, and you have over 30 years of experience in the field of natural protection, and especially in the study of conservation of wild birds and their critical habitats. You're an experienced biologist, ornithologist, scientific researcher, a lecturer, and a former decision maker in the field of environmental protection. Your work experience extends to Albania as well as other Balkan countries, including neighboring Kosovo and Montenegro. Founder of Albanian Ornithological Society, AOS, in 2015, and president of AOS for 8 consecutive years. A national coordinator for Albania for International Waterbird Census. On behalf of the Wetlands International, member of the Technical Committee of the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement. Dr. Bino, if I continue, I'm quite sure that it'll take me longer to actually introduce who you are than the topics we chose to have for our discussion today. So I would rather actually focus on the topics, make sure that they're kept short, clear, but yet very interesting for our audience, who I'm sure is very keen to listen to the very end of our discussion, all we have to say today. Allow me just, for the sake of the conversation, to remind the two of us, ourselves, and to share with the audience that beautiful trip of ours several years ago in the south part of the country, when I, for the first time, received information about nesting places of white stork in the southern part of Albania. Amazing experience for everyone, including myself. I'm an amateur when it comes to birds, but I love them. So that said, I will briefly, with your permission, introduce our audience to today's topics, and then, of course, pass the word to you to touch upon some of those important points and discuss together as much as we can. Why CSOs are important, how they actually began to take shape in the 1990s, why they're so important when it comes to nature protection and wildlife conservation in Albania, what is the evolution in their attitude of the public when it comes to engaging with CSOs, volunteering, etc., how AOS, and that's another important aspect of our discussion today, managed to organize recently an excellent public forum on the protection of protected areas. And I would like to know more about that. How difficult it is to engage the community nowadays in our country, and knowing where we come from and knowing all the transition, many years of transition have elapsed since the 1990s, and how that is reflected into the daily discussion when it comes to engaging communities, and also from your personal experience, and that would be perhaps the last important topic to discuss together today, which would be some of the best practices when it comes to nature conservation in Albania, and what AOS does and what you guys do there. And I know you're a passionate group of experts. Pretty much, you never stay in your office. I've always seen you outside your office, but you need to go back to your office and compile all the data that you gather and inform thus the public and other partners on the European scale, but also worldwide. So let me just touch on the first topic. Go, let's say, through 2 or 3 small questions and just try to frame this conversation together, and then allow you to actually say your kind thoughts, share with us, or even ask questions if needs be.
May I just make a short intervention, because it's a discussion among friends, let's say. I too remember the trip in southern part of Albania, looking at the nest of the white stork. And I even remember the discussion about 6 breeding pairs of white storks, 3 of them in the high voltage power lines, and 3 others in churches. And I said to you at the time
in the bell towers of churches.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And I said to you at the time that it shows that human disturbance might be an issue, because churches are protected by God, and the other nests are protected by high voltage.
That's correct. I very well remember that.
And it goes on as such. But it's a pleasure for me to discuss with you. We've been together and we've been discussing several times, and I'm pretty sure today will be a nice discussion.
Thank you, Taulant. It's actually highly appreciated, all the discussion that we had in the south and the introduction.
And I hope we have more experience in the north.
Yeah. And the introduction you gave me to the white stork actually has served me to guide through the southern part of the country lots of foreigners interested in bird watching, but also understanding better the area, and by showing them this potential and actually using some of the wording you actually used that time with me, the interest has gone high up. So I can tell that the more you guys find, the more you share with the public and us, it's actually beneficial for everyone. Yeah. So let me bug you with some of my questions for today and spark this conversation and give it a heads up. What is this concept of CSOs from the 1990s, Taulant? What happened after the collapse of communism in our country, and what is happening through those 30 plus years of the democratic system? What were the main challenges of CSOs contributing in the field of environment and nature conservation, and what do you see as a major difference with today's challenges? What can you share with us and the audience?
Yep, thank you. It's indeed a very much different picture compared with today, but nevertheless some of the main environmental issues remain as such. But people should never forget Albania 30 years ago. It was completely different in terms of economics and everything else. So if we talk about environmental organizations at that time, we should understand also what were the main environmental problematics of the era. And I believe in the 90s, we came from a different system, which had no knowledge about civil society organizations. Everything was forbidden before the 90s. Well, and after the 90s, we changed it completely different to topics. People were fighting for survival. Albania was the last communist country of Europe, very, very poor.
That's correct.
And people were fighting for survival, so the main issues were mostly towards economic survival rather than environment. Nevertheless, when you have poverty, you have also environmental issues, huge environmental issues, because they are strongly related. And there was immediately too much pressure upon nature resources. Maybe not in a organized form, in terms of enterprises, corporates, etc., but pressure was everywhere. And I could see with my own eyes that there were huge problems in in cutting trees, but not cutting trees. What is called in English, it's in logging, illegal logging, let's say, and also in poaching, which is illegal hunting, let's say.
And it became rather extensive, right?
It became rather extensive because people were trying to take resources from nature and bring them at home in a way or another.
Choosing the easy way.
Firewood or selling wood, etc. So there was a huge pressure on habitats because there was a vacuum from the dictatorship to another society. Institutions were not really functional. And there was a vacuum of institutional authority, so people exploited that, and there was poverty in the middle. So environmental problematic at the time was different. The main issues at the area were illegal logging and poaching. That's what I see. And somehow the civil society organizations have to take the shape of the situation. Nevertheless, this was not a bottom-up approach. It was a top-down approach, as in many cases, as in many countries. So some people, maybe professors from university, they thought about developing their own groups with environmental NGOs. They started creating different environmental NGOs. So the first ones were of 91 or 92, if I'm not wrong, and they were rather generalists, so covering every topic in the environment rather than specific, because there were too many issues.
I understand.
So at the time, that was the let's say the situation of environmental civil society organizations. Then they, with time, they started to focus even more on problematic environmental issues, and now we can say that some of them are really highly specialized, as it is the case of the Albanian Ornithological Society that I represent.
Yeah, we will be able to touch upon AOS and the activities they organize and the focus they have been placing in the study.
But somehow this question has connections also with the role of the public, etc. Because we should understand that Albania was not only the last communist country in Europe, but it was also very different from the other communist countries of Europe. So there is no comparison between Albania and Bulgaria, Albania and Hungary, or etc., the Eastern Bloc. We were somehow outside of everything.
Yeah,
and we have a kind of specific experience.
Yeah, that's we were kind of disattached from every initiative that took place in those neighboring, relatively speaking, countries or the Eastern Bloc. And although we were part of the Eastern Bloc, we were not part of the Eastern Bloc when it comes to experiences like this. What if I would ask and say, when it comes to wildlife conservation in Albania, nature protection, how important are those CSOs that we're touching upon today? In your opinion, Taulant, which you would recall as being the most important achievements of CSOs in conservation during the last 30 years? I mean, you rightly put forward the information that, yes, some CSOs have managed to specialize themselves, and they're dealing at great length with specific issues that wildlife conservation has in the country. But in your opinion, what would be the best or the maximum achievement that those CSOs have achieved so far when it comes to this change of regime, but also concepts, also public engagement, which we will be discussing later on again?
Well, if I'm not wrong, some 10 or 15 years ago, I was engaged in a kind of consultancy with the UNDP Albania regarding the evolution of civil society organizations in Albania in the field of environment. And at that time, I registered some 120 environmental NGOs, most of them based in Tirana. And at that time. So now it might be even higher, maybe the double. But most of them were concentrated in Tirana.
I like those 3-digit numbers.
Yeah, most of them were concentrated in Tirana, although they were focusing their work outside of Tirana. And the general characteristic was that they were not really specialized. They were covering different topics in environment.
Generally.
So they were more budget driven rather than problematic driven.
I see.
Now it has changed a bit. During those years, there has been also a great evolution of civil society organizations in terms of public involvement, in terms of specialization of NGOs. But I can say that also it's a kind of situation similar with other Balkan countries, where there is a vacuum of institutional coverage sometimes of different topics, and therefore NGOs explore that vacuum for creating their own niche, and in some topics they have become much more specialized than public institutions, and they know more than public institutions. Sometimes they have become the advisors of the public institutions, and this is something good. You don't find it in the West because there is a strong bureaucracy, institutions have a long history, etc. But in the East, you have a lot of times where NGOs play a great role because they somehow lobby with the government towards policies on environmental protection or nature protection. And since they have more expertise, they can influence the decision making.
So you're saying that some CSOs have better databases on specific topics than what the government has?
For sure. So for instance, in our case, we have data on birds since the beginning of 1992.
Which data is lacking from state-owned institutions.
It's almost 30
right?
years, and the institutions are lacking those data, although we share with them the data.
Yeah,
but nevertheless, the knowledge, there is more knowledge among the NGOs in terms of expertise. So even the analysis of such data, it's not such an easy thing. Usually it's done by NGOs. So NGOs, in terms of expertise, now have a very much stronger role, especially in nature protection. Most of expertise is in the NGOs.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds like the bottom-up approach and bridging the gap.
Which is good, but on the other hand, you need public institutions to understand the issues,
and be strong
enough to promote the policies, environmental protection policies, etc.
Yeah.
So it's good and bad. Yeah. But in terms of expertise, NGOs have provided a large expertise, and they represent Albania in different topics elsewhere also, not only in Albania. So they have increased their capacity, sometimes more than institutions, and they have supported the strengthening of capacities and also in public institutions. For instance, expertise from NGOs have been involved in training of administration that covers environment in general, but nature protection, let's focus on nature protection. So, for instance, we have been engaged in training members of the Agency for Protected Areas in monitoring, identification of species, monitoring, etc. NGOs have been very much at the loop of environmental awareness by contributing towards environmental awareness. For instance, in Divjaka, we have more than 30 years of experience working with Dalmatian pelican. And by being there, working almost every day or just having a coffee somewhere just in the area, people know that those are the guys working for the pelicans, for Dalmatian pelicans. And this is for sure somehow supporting the environmental awareness. And if we have some achievements, sometimes they are part of this environmental awareness that have taken a long way to come.
Constant attention to
and this is a contribution of NGOs, quite a great contribution. Not only NGOs, the society in general, but NGOs have been rather specific on this. And I could say also that today we are facing the issue of protected areas. We will discuss perhaps later on this. But we are discussing our protected areas because there are protected areas. And if there are protected areas, they have been designated due to the information being provided by NGOs. For instance, data on birds, importance of a certain area in terms of national importance, international importance on birds. Those come from NGOs. This kind of information come from NGOs. Sometimes the pressure comes from the NGOs. And if I would consider a great achievement of NGOs, even though there are problems, I would say the designation of protected areas either at national level or international level. Ramsar sites at international level, important bird areas, key biodiversity areas, etc. Yeah. So if I may try to make a list, I would say public awareness, strengthening of capacities, raising and strengthening capacities, and as well as providing data for wildlife in general in Albania, for nature protection in Albania, and designation of protected areas.
Definitely, these are some of the most, let's say, crucial pillars when it comes to the importance of the CSOs regarding nature protection and wildlife conservation. And you mentioned, rightly so, the awareness raising and the meetings with local population and interested parties, let's say, in your job, in your daily job. And what is this? Have you seen an evolution regarding the public? And this would be my third topic for our discussion when it comes to engaging with CSOs. Volunteering especially, can you touch upon that? I think it's an important... let's not confuse that with volunteering before the 1990s, right? You will make a distinction what volunteering means today and what... because I know there is young audiences perhaps following us and that they're interested in what we're discussing, but please make sure you distinguish between what volunteering today in what you do is good and why it's healthy and why you want more and more, not just youngsters, but everyone and all ages are invited to contribute and volunteer. And why is this important for the environment and nature conservation? I mean, we talk about those topics, we touch upon those topics. Our little ones at school learn about them, but is that enough? That's something you can touch upon in your discussion. And is lack of public trust and support a persisting issue? And I think you wanted to say something about that. You spoke about public institutions, but how important is to have strong public institutions and this public trust in the overall discussion we're having about environment and nature protection. Please, Taulant, you can choose which answers you can give us, but also which questions you want to target. But it would be nice to have this discussion in whichever way, simple way you want, in the most simple words you can choose, just to make sure everyone interested and willing to contribute and understand this field can actually be part of this discussion today.
Yeah, it's good to make the comparison between Albania before the 90s and after the 90s. And I even remember one day when I was lecturing at Polish University, we were talking about environmental policy, etc., but we are in a different area. And outside it was December, and it was somehow the anniversary of student movements of the 90s, early 90s. And by seeing those pictures at the hall of Polish University, I said to my students, it's better to stop now the discussion on environmental policies and let's look outside, to not forget the past. Because it's very important to think about the past. Some of them have raised under a new regime, and maybe they will forget what was about. And that kind of regime has also its influence on the behavior of people towards environment.
And the perception towards environment.
Yeah. For instance, I feel that people are nostalgic about the period of Enver Hoxha because there was rule of state. It indeed was dictatorship. There were no major environmental issues, only those done by the state himself, not by the public at large. And after the 90s, they changed completely. So even the involvement of people in the NGOs was quite different. And I had also once quite an interesting discussion about the involvement of public in other Eastern European countries in order to compare it with Albania. Because usually NGOs are small in Albania. Just very few of them are membership-based. AOS is a membership-based association, and there are usually difficulties in engaging people becoming members. But that is quite different from Western European countries for sure, but even in Eastern European countries there is such a kind of problem. I found that Hungary was quite different because in the communist area, although they were not in a such strict dictatorship as in Albania, they had the possibility to join the environmental organizations. And since those were the few free, let's say, places where they can connect with each other, somehow this allows to increase the interest of people in such organizations and the interest of nature. Albania was totally different from that.
Yeah, that's true.
There were trade unions, they were totally organized, controlled, etc.
And more than several people together would be considered hostile activities. So the Hungarians found a way how to get together and express even their, let's say, political views internally.
True.
We did not find that way.
Yeah,
so,
we did have that kind of past. But we were quite different, and this is somehow related with the first topic. At the very beginning, people were very much concerned about this survival, and they were not thinking a lot about environment. So in the 90s, it was very difficult to engage people in let's say willingly to nature protection. That's why it was a top-down approach rather than bottom-up approach. But with the years, somehow Albania is not comparable with 30 years ago. It's quite a different country now. And even in terms of democracy, we will always say that there are obstacles, but democracy is progressing. And somehow even the younger people are becoming, even in education programs in schools are somehow focusing young people in environment. And there is a higher interest. Although this higher interest, it's somehow interrupted by economic policies, etc. But nevertheless, we saw especially in the last 10 years, quite an engagement from young people towards environmental conservation, and let's say about volunteering. And they are participating in a lot of activities. They are much more interested in outdoor activities. They come for fun, but they gain an experience. And we see that in the last years, there is a kind of development towards that. When I said on purpose in the last 10 years, not about the last 2 years, because in the last 2 years, due to that the drain of brain drain, let's say in Albania, we are losing capacities. But somehow, up to 2 years ago, there was a great interest towards environmental protection in Albania. It still is, but not as such as the peak was just, let's say, 2 or 3 years ago. So with young people, educated people, it was easy to connect. It is more difficult with local communities. But with local communities, you need to be persistent. And persistence means that somehow an organization should make an area its own area, being present there almost every week, let's say. It's impossible to be every day, but every week. And
show the local community the benefit of protecting, promoting, properly presenting the values of their given community, let's say, and the natural habitat.
Yeah, but you can't do that with just a lecture in a school. You need to do it.
That's not enough.
In many years' time, and
several generations.
And I looked some time ago. I looked at the pictures taken in Divjaka in the 90s. I saw myself 20 years ago, young and beautiful. Nevertheless, I saw young people that maybe I will never remember them. But it somehow shows to me that we started the public awareness activities some 20 years ago. And when you go now in Divjaka, you see that the round points, the entrance of Divjaka, there are 2 or 3 pelicans, or even 4, which means that somehow the municipality took the pelicans and their own symbol. And this does not come easily. It shows that somehow the opinion there grew up saying that pelicans are our symbols, and somehow they have to protect their symbols.
This is the power of sharing and the inclusion.
It takes a lot of time, and you should be present there. So it's not easy. It's only done through persistence, being there in the area.
That's why we're lucky to have you today, because otherwise you would be in Divjaka, Karavasta, most probably working.
Yeah, let's say. But I work a lot in the office, contrary to the opinion. Yeah, I show to people just my best part of my life, being outside. But I spend a lot of time in the office
so
too.
It's like those Instagram photos, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned something regarding Taulant, regarding the inclusion of young generation, and I was personally with you and the AOS team on the waterbird census, and I saw passionate, enthusiastic youngsters willing to undergo the freezing morning temperatures and the lengthy walks or drives around, personally, Divjaka, and willing to understand, learn, count, and be part of the initiative. Do you think we're going to have in several years' time the peak moment of 2 or 3 years ago? Do you think is a positive trend still regarding this brain drain you mentioned, which I'm very well aware? Do you think still keeping close enough around AOS, but also either CSOs, this still very energetic group of young people, can we still go back to those peak numbers of engagement, public engagement and understanding?
Yeah, but I just hope that it will change.
Definitely, that's what I wanted to hear. Being hopeful, because that's part of what you do every day with your team.
Yeah, but we keep trying. What you have seen, indeed, it's part of our efforts since many years now to increase the capacities in bird identification, which is not only bird identification, because we organize courses, which are quite long courses, some 5-6 months, and students are with us in the field for every two weeks, and they spend a lot of time. At the very beginning they spend a few hours and they think, what are those people telling about birds, bird songs, bird calls, bird images, etc. But slowly they start understanding, and I've seen a kind of evolution even with our students in the courses.
I see.
At first they were talking about everything. At the end of the course they were talking only about birds, which is sometimes not a great achievement, because there are a lot of possibilities in life, not only birds. But somehow I saw a kind of evolution in their spirit, which is quite good, because make them really focus on birds. But birds are everything, are protected areas, are nature conservation in itself. So this is part of our efforts to increase the capacities in bird watching, bird identification, bird protection, and this means birds are everywhere, so you protect the environment everywhere. Birds are in urban areas, are in countryside, everywhere. Everywhere we see birds.
This is a contribution also, a solid contribution to the upgrading of the professional aspect of national bird watchers and people who are equipped with all the knowledge to serve as official national certified tour guides just about bird watching. So let's not exclude that also as a contribution, because professional approach, as you mentioned, is very good to the upgrading of all these number of individuals who are willing to travel around the country, show others the beauties of the country, but also focus on bird watching. Of course, experts can do that at all times, and they do it, and they've always done it. And it's good that those experts also are the leading force regarding the formation and the correct formation of those who are going to serve as the facilitators regarding bird watching in the country.
For instance, when we go in areas, either through this course or different activities, we talk about birds, but we talk also the problems that birds are facing. And you can't, for instance, go in Shkodra and do not talk about urban pollution or urban development. You can't go to Divjaka and talk about the threats that the ecosystem were facing with Divjaka Resort, Albania, a kind of problematic proposition that came by private enterprise. You can't go to Narta and do not talk about the problems that birds will face with the airport of Lora. So everywhere we go, we talk about birds, but we talk about nature conservation. And I think this is quite a great contribution, because it creates a kind of generation that is thoughtful about environment, that is interested in the environmental importance of the area, and it's quite feels about environment.
And this ties in, Taulant, very well with the fourth topic I've chosen for our discussion today regarding AOS and the recent public forum on the protection of protected areas. What are the challenges today about protected areas? You mentioned some. Perhaps we can go over some of the most important aspects. What are some of the steps taken by NGOs in advocating for the preservation of the ecological integrity of protected areas? Share with us. I'm very keen to hear myself.
Yep. Indeed, it looks a bit funny to talk about protection of protected areas, because when you say protected areas, means that they are protected by law. And if there is a law for their protection, why should they be threatened? And why should we focus on their protection?
But as you know, we never take things for granted. That's why we ask the question.
Yeah. And indeed, there is a huge pressure in last years upon protected areas, especially the coastal area, because the coastal area is the main economics area for Albania. It's easy in terms of infrastructure, so it's easy to make investments there rather than in the mountainous area, where access is quite difficult, etc. So I've seen in the last 10 years a huge pressure upon protected areas at the coast, or let's say wetland protected areas. And up to now, this was somehow a pressure, everyday pressure. But some 2 years ago, we started to see that the Albanian government was intervening by reducing the size of coastal protected areas. That would allow for sure for unsustainable developments inside the protected areas. It's of interest, I think, for those people that hear us that to know that major strategic investments in Albania are exactly focused on coastal protected areas.
I see.
So let's say tourism developments, airports,
real estate,
real estates, energy infrastructure,
roads.
Although solar energy, it's a renewable, etc. Still, it occupies a certain habitat, and there is a pressure upon protected areas. So it's nothing wrong against such developments outside the protected areas, but inside protected areas, it makes no sense, because they somehow attack the ecological integrity of protected areas, and they grab one part here, one part there, and if we put all them together and consider the cumulative effects of every kind of activity, then we might have quite a different picture in the future if we don't try to defend.
I understand.
Now. That's why we organized the forum, because there have been 2 decisions from the Albanian government at the early 2022, where they reduced the size of coastal protected areas, and we are sure that this will allow for further developments, unsustainable developments in protected areas.
And those areas are mostly focused in the north or western part of the country, northwest?
It's western part of the country, but I can go more in details. For instance, Shkodra Lake has been, the protected areas of Shkodra Lake has been reduced by, let's say, 1,700 hectares.
And that comes for
it's
obvious reason
10%.
What are the general reasons behind the reducing?
Yeah, sometimes,
since you mentioned the reducing of the sizes of the protected areas.
The opinion from the Agency for Protected Areas were that those areas are useless because they are used for agriculture.
Okay.
And in some other parts there have been already urban developments, so if there are urban developments we can't protect them anymore, so let's give it to further urban development.
I see.
So it depends on the area. But although the government is saying that those areas are useless, we have evidences that show that those areas, although not natural habitats anymore but modified habitats, they are quite important for wildlife.
Because they serve as buffer zone between the already untouched and pristine part of the protected areas.
It's not only a buffer zone, for sure it is, but it's also the way the traditional economy has been developed in Albania, For instance, if we go to Shkodra, we see that we have medicinal plants, or how's called these plants, Heterovaiore, or producing perfumes, etc.
Yes.
And this is not a very intensive exploitation. It's kind of extensive exploitation. And somehow nature tolerates this because it's no intensity. And if you look at Albania in general, every country in the world, it's done by human involvement. We don't live in a pristine habitat without humans. We live in a habitat where humans have, you know better than me that humans are have their own track record.
My experience with the past is rather good.
Yeah,
that's correct.
I think so. Yeah. So humans have a track record everywhere. And if we see birds and nature today, we see because of this interaction. In the moment you change this interaction, you go from extensive activities to intensive activities, then you change it completely. And there is no place for wildlife. For instance, in the areas of Shkodra, we have identified that there are a lot of species that use this part of agricultural land for finding food, some of them breeding there, etc. And we are showing to the government that those areas are important.
I understand.
And it's the same story with other. Yeah. It's the same story with other areas. For instance, in Kunevain, let's say a protected area, a part of the reed bed is now it's been excluded from the protected areas. It has been filled already with construction material that will allow for tourism development, perhaps huge resorts.
Which in turn will damage the balance.
For sure, it influences the balance, but it fragments the habitat. It goes against the connection of habitats and species. It creates a kind of barrier effect, human pressure, etc., and it could spread even further and could put the protected area itself, the remaining part of protected areas, under huge pressure. It's the same story in Divjaka, Karavasta. It's the same story in Butrin. The same story in Vjos, Narta, etc.
I understand.
And we see that as a huge issue, the major issue in nature conservation in the last 10 years. And that's why we are totally involved in that. But not alone as an NGO. We are in a coalition with some 50 other Albanian NGOs.
It's exactly this public forum that involved this huge energy of NGOs, but also the interested public and all those who advocate for the nature conservation.
And we, as you have noticed, we had representatives from all over the world and institutions. It shows that although Albania is a small country, its geographical position is quite interesting. I remember that during the communist time we were saying that we are the jewel of Europe, we are in the center of it, but somehow we are at the Adriatic flyway.
It's a crossroad.
It's a crossroad, and due to that lack of huge intensive economic development in the past, we have somehow protected our coastal area. It has still a nature character. And that's why, although being a small part of it is quite important for birds that migrate south or migrate north, or even other animals. And that's why we are fighting. When we fight for them, we do not fight only for protected areas of Albania. We fight for thousands of species and thousands of animals and millions of animals for Europe. And that's why, due to that importance, they are designated not only as national protected areas, but also as international sites, important bird areas, Ramsar sites, etc. And we see that there's such a huge economic pressure might threaten their ecological integrity, and we are against this. And we are already in the court. Today I was in a court session. We have 2 lawsuits against the governmental decisions. And today we discuss for nature managed reserve and also national parks, and we remain hopeful that we will win this kind of battle, because it's just a battle. It's not a war. War itself, it takes much longer, and I don't think it will finish with me. It will go on forever.
Yeah, but there are various sayings of famous generals who say that winning a battle does not mean you won the war, but on the contrary, winning a battle gives you hopes of winning a lengthy war. So I hope you are in good terms with the judiciary regarding those 2 lawsuits, and please, you will make sure you share with us later on whatever outcomes you have from those actions, very civic and responsible actions you're taking. And may I just, with your permission, Taulant, try to touch upon again, just briefly, on the local communities. It's a very important aspect. I myself work in another field, but still I touch on the local communities. We talk to them in our job. And positive attitudes towards nature conservation, why it's important for these communities to invest on them in the success of conservation efforts. You mentioned some of the aspects. You said of those early moments 20 years ago when you were young, and you still look at those moments very positively, and you see still today lots of people from the local communities still interested, and you though need to strive hard to actually keep their attention there and to show them the benefit of nature conservation. Can you share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, this is quite an important topic, but very, very difficult. Sometimes it's very extremely difficult because usually communities think about short-term
benefits or results.
Yeah. Short-term results, short-term benefits, and nature conservation shows its results quite slowly.
Yeah.
So it takes time.
It's a long-term process.
It takes time. So if we have not fought for Divjaka Karavasta, we might have another Durrës or Golem area with large buildings, etc., which it might be interesting in the very first year, but slowly it has lost its interest, and even the properties have lost their own value. As you know, now in the area of Durrës, there are apartments. Their price has fallen quite low. Nobody's interested to buy them anymore, and we lost not only environment, but we lost also properties somehow.
And especially in the southern part of Durrës, we lost the historical landscapes of the various engagements between Caesar and Pompey over 2,000 years ago, apart from nature.
Yeah. And indeed, this is the same story for Divjaka Karavasta. So if NGOs were not there to fight for, we might have quite a different picture in the area. We might have a new development, a new city, which is somehow putting would have taken, on my opinion, not only my opinion, but also the NGO in general, would have taken the interest from Divjaka as an urban area towards the seaside. And at that time, we tried to explain to the local community that if we have a new development, your village will be, or the city of Divjaka will be just a ghost city, because people will pass through it, will never explore its resources, they will go to the beach immediately. Nevertheless, for communities, they were interested in short-term benefit, and they were saying that there will be open places, so we will find job there. And it might be true, but we have bad examples, and we try to convince them that there are bad examples already for that, where there is just a seasonal involvement, not every year involvement, etc. And so the benefits are not there. We are losing rather than gaining. Nevertheless, it's quite difficult to explain that to local communities. I could say that we have also experience with the advocacy campaigns of NGOs for hydropowers. Sometimes there the local communities are much more involved, because they are seeing that a part of their land will be flooded and they will lose agriculture.
So they have a direct connection to the topic.
The direct connection. In other cases, it's quite difficult to talk about this direct connection. So, for instance, to explain people that you should protect the pelican in order to increase your economic prosperity, it's quite difficult. We have achieved some of that, because now the number of tourists is increasing. Divjaka Karavasta is a major area. People come, they use the restaurants, so they use not only nature but also the economic chain over there. But if we talk about a little tern species and say this is important, it's quite difficult. Nevertheless, I said in the very beginning, you should be in the area, you should be persistent, and try always with them, and use every opportunity to convince them. It's not an easy game. It should go on forever. It's quite difficult.
But I'm sure that with the young generation of experts, which I've seen personally and know personally for a long time now, there will be some green light at the end of the tunnel. I'm quite sure. I'm already visioning it and seeing it, but I'm sure that it will work out. And exactly at this point in time, I would like to throw in for discussion perhaps my last few questions for today's discussion, and from a personal perspective and experience, what would be some of the best practices when it comes to nature conservation in Albania, and what is the direct contribution of AOS in nature conservation in Albania? Perhaps this is the moment to mention whatever we did not discuss today in our beautiful talk.
Thank you. Well, we touched upon the major contributions. We might touch them again. I somehow feel proud that I'm part of the Albanian Ornithological Society. We think that we played a role, especially towards nature conservation in Albania, because we are an NGO being founded in 2015, but rather focused. We are focused on protection of birds and their critical habitats. But when we say this, we are covering almost everything, because, as I said in the very beginning, birds are everywhere. So birds are in an urban area. They need a kind of intensive. They need extensive exploitation of resources in order to survive, and we fight for that. And if we are in the countryside, we talk about birds. We talk about agriculture plots that allow this diversity. We talk about lagoons that have fish and they allow for water birds feeding there, etc. So talking about birds, you talk about everything. It's not so. It looks specific, but it rather covers a rather large area of intervention. And we were founded in 2015 by a group of enthusiast people. And immediately I could say that we had an impact upon public awareness on birds. We started by showing people the importance of Albania in terms of birds. That was somehow known for the outside world, but inside Albania people were not very much known. We were innovative in our approach, trying to link the classical monitoring and research with public involvement, for instance through art. We started some ideas at that time through art. We invited people to sketch in different lagoon areas. They started sketching birds, etc. And I think by this innovative approach and being present also in the media, we were somehow contributing towards conservation of birds and the conservation of nature in general. But we are an NGO not only focused on art and birds, we are focused on bird species, on habitats, and our recent battle for protected areas shows that we have quite a kind of strong influence on policies. We are policy-driven, legislation-driven, lobbying-driven, advocacy-driven. So I think that as an NGO we have been providing quite a good contribution towards nature conservation in Albania, but we are not alone. For sure, we are with other NGOs in that kind of endeavor. But coming back to the contributions of the NGOs, without forgetting the today contributions for the protection of protected areas, protection of species. For instance, we talked about the Dalmatian pelican. It's not the only one. We talked about the white stork. It's not the only one. We talk about water birds in general all over. We talk about the areas of importance for water birds. We talk about recently we talk about the Egyptian vulture. I told you that how challenging species it is, but what kind of pleasure it gives you in the field. So we are involved in programs in protecting species and protection of habitats. And somehow we're playing a role, and we try to involve in our work also other NGOs and create synergies with them, as we have created in the kind of campaign for protected areas and law suites for protected areas. So I might say that without forgetting those current contributions, we should say that NGOs have have been quite active in designating protected areas that are somehow the basis for protection of environment in Albania today. Public awareness, it's quite a great achievement, and it should go on for sure. And also increasing the institutional capacities, it's quite also an achievement of NGOs. Increasing capacities in general in education, because it's kind of creates a kind of generation that is able to know nature and maybe contribute for a better nature.
And I would say it's a step-by-step process, and through this discussion of ours today, we went through some of the most important pillars, which I mentioned at the very beginning in my short introduction. I would like to say thank you, Taulant, for your time, your opinions, your thoughtful comments, your concerns, hopes, and yes, hope and being hopeful, I think, is what keeps this work of yours and AOS, but also other partner CSOs and individuals which are trying and striving all the time regarding nature conservation and environmental protection, also protected areas and so on. So thank you again for your time, and we will meet again on other podcasts discussing conservation in Albania, not just the role of civil society organizations, but other topics as well, which I think will enlighten those who follow us and also the public understanding more about nature conservation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and next time we could talk about everything else other than birds.
Duly noted. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure.